There is a moment that the people of Harlan County still talk about, though most of them were not there to see it themselves and have only the word of those who were. It was the last week of September in the year 1897, and the morning fog had not yet lifted off the creek bottoms when Nora Vass opened the gate of a timber post fence she had mended herself, strand by strand, over the course of a long and bug-loud summer. She opened it wide, both hands on the post, and what came through was not exactly a flood, though it moved the way a flood moves, low to the ground, purposeful, unstoppable, and altogether indifferent to the opinions of onlookers. 43 goats of every size and coloring poured through that gate and spread across the lower hillside of what had been, for 17 years, the most comprehensively ruined piece of land in the whole of the county. The wisteria had grown so thick on the upper slope that a man on horseback could not have passed through it without a hatchet. The fence rows were buried, the creekside willows had been wrapped and pulled nearly to the ground, and the barn, if it was still a barn and not simply a green breathing mound, was invisible from the road. Nora stood at the gate and watched her animals go to work, and she did something that the handful of witnesses present could not, afterward, quite agree on. Some said she smiled, some said she said something quiet to herself. One old man, who had leaned on the fence post with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, and who had told anyone who would listen that the whole enterprise was a catastrophe in slow motion, said that she simply nodded. Once, as though some private conversation with the land had at last reached its conclusion. 4 years earlier, not one person in Harlan County would have believed any of this was possible. 4 years earlier, Nora Vass had been 22 years old, and she had $31 to her name. She had come into those $31 honestly, and had spent the preceding winter earning most of them by keeping the books for the dry goods store on the main road, a task the store's owner, Mr. Bratch, Alderton, paid her in cash at the end of each month, and, in mild condescension, every day between. She had a good head for figures, everyone agreed on that. What she would do with a good head for figures was a question nobody had troubled themselves to answer, because the general consensus in town was that a young woman alone, no father living, no brother, no husband on the horizon, had a limited number of paths available to her, and none of them ran through 80 acres of Wisteria Strangled bottomland. That land had come up for sale at the county tax office the previous October, delinquent on its taxes for the better part of a decade, and the county had advertised it in the small notices at the back of the weekly paper for 3 weeks running. Nobody bid. The land had belonged to a family named Pruitt, and the last of the Pruitts had walked off it in 1879 and never come back, and the reason nobody bid was simple enough. The land was considered worse than worthless. 80 acres of river-bottom clay that flooded every spring, thick with wisteria vine, that had over nearly 2 decades of unchecked growth, consumed every fence, every outbuilding, every planted row, and was currently in the process of consuming the old Pruitt barn from the outside in. The county assessor, a man named Burwell who wore his watch chain like a decoration of rank, said at the post office one morning that the county would be doing anyone a disservice to let them pay good money for that ground. He said it as though he were performing a public service, and several men nodded along with him. Nora Vass had been standing at the far end of the post office counter waiting for her mail, and she heard every word of it. She had also, 3 weeks prior, walked the full perimeter of the Pruitt land on a cold, clear afternoon in October, moving slowly, reading the ground the way her grandfather had taught her to read the ground before he died. He had been a man who farmed the same rocky Tennessee hillside for 51 years, and who had held, as a matter of near religious conviction, that land does not lie. People lie about land, he had told her once, sitting on the porch, with his hands on his knees. But the land itself only ever tells you one thing, and that thing is the truth. What it tells you might be a hard truth, but it is never a wrong one. You have to be willing to hear it. What Nora had heard, walking the Pruitt land in October, was not the ruinous verdict that Burwell and the town had already written. What she heard, what she saw, more precisely because reading land is a visual language, was water. The bottomland held moisture long after the surrounding fields had dried to dust. The clay subsoil, so often cited as the land's fatal flaw, was also the reason the wisteria had grown with such violent enthusiasm. It was genuinely, extravagantly fertile ground that had not been farmed in 17 years. Neglected, not ruined, resting, not dead. And the barn, she had pushed through the wisteria far enough to lay her hands on the barn's foundation timbers, and they were hand-hewn oak, 18 inches across, still solid at the center, still giving back nothing when she pressed her thumb into the grain. The wisteria had kept the rain off them as faithfully as any roof. She put in a bid of $28 at the county tax office on a Tuesday morning, which left her $3 for what came next. Burwell took her money with an expression of genuine pity. She walked out into the November cold and began to think about goats. The thinking about goats had begun, in truth, before the bid. It had begun on that cold October afternoon on the Pruitt land, when she had stood in the green tunnel of wisteria and understood, with a clarity that she kept entirely to herself, that the vine was not the land's enemy. It was the land's interim tenant, and like any tenant, it could be removed. The question was how. Clearing 80 acres of mature wisteria by hand would take years and cost more money than she had or could borrow. Fire was dangerous on river-bottom land and apt to jump. But wisteria. She had read this in an agricultural bulletin that the county extension had sent to every landowner in the district, a bulletin that had clearly been filed and forgotten by everyone who received it. Wisteria is a legume, and goats will eat legumes with a devotion that borders on the theological. They will eat the vine, the leaves, the new growth, the old growth, and then come back for the roots. They do not browse and move on. They persist. They are. The bulletin had stated in its dry official language, highly effective at the biological control of invasive vine species, where mechanical clearing is impractical. Nora had read that sentence 4 times. She had then spent 2 weeks learning everything. The county library and the extension office could tell her about goats, which was not very much. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Bed Oglesby, who wore her hair in a high gray bun and had opinions about everything, said that goats were, in her experience, nothing but trouble in a fur coat. The extension agent said they were useful animals, but hard to fence and not worth the heartache for a small operation. What Nora needed, she decided, was not an opinion. What she needed was someone who had actually kept goats on difficult ground and had come out ahead. She found him by way of the feed merchant, who mentioned, almost as an aside, that old Theodore Bella up the North Road kept a mixed herd and had for 30 years and never seemed to want for anything, which the feed merchant found privately irritating, because Theodore bought less feed per animal than anyone else in the county, and his animals were never thin. Nora walked the 4 miles to Theodore Bella's place on a Saturday morning in early December, and she came back in the afternoon, knowing 3 things she had not known when she left: the right breed of goat for rough brush clearance, the minimum acreage required per animal to prevent overgrazing in a brushy stand, and the going price for a good mixed-age starter herd of 8. She also came back with a cup of Theodore's wife's tea, warming her from the inside, and a sentence of Theodore's that she turned over in her mind the whole 4 miles home. He had said it when she explained what she was trying to do, said it without any particular drama, sitting in his kitchen with his big rough hands wrapped around his own cup. The people who think a thing is worthless are almost always telling you where the opportunity is hiding. He had a slow, accented way of speaking, Theodore, as though each word had been examined before it was allowed out. She wrote the sentence down that evening in the small notebook she kept for figures, and she did not show it to anyone. The following spring, she had her 8 goats. She had traded a winter's worth of bookkeeping for 5 of them, 2 does, 2 wethers, and a young buck, from a farmer up near the ridge who was liquidating his herd to pay a debt, and she had bought the remaining 3 from Theodore at a price he named with such transparent fairness that she had checked it twice against what the feed merchant said they were worth before she allowed herself to believe it. She built a temporary pen from salvaged lumber and wire on the driest corner of the Pruitt land, close enough to the road that she could reach it on foot, and she put the goats in it, with access to the first fringe of wisteria. She did not tell anyone what she was doing, or rather, she said nothing about it that invited further inquiry. When people saw her walking the North Road with a feed sack over her shoulder, she answered their questions plainly enough. Yes, she had bought the Pruitt land. Yes, she had some animals on it, and then she said nothing more, and because there was nothing dramatic to report, interest died quickly. The town had already reached its verdict. It was not looking for new evidence. What happened over that first summer was not dramatic, but it was, in the way of things that are quietly correct, deeply satisfying to watch if you were the one watching. The goats ate. And matters. 6. They ate with a focused and almost professional intensity that Nora found, she admitted to herself alone, genuinely moving to witness. They stripped the wisteria from the fence rows nearest the pen first. Then, as she expanded the pen section by section across the lower hillside, they advanced into the thicker stands with the same calm thoroughness. By June, the lower quarter of the property showed grass. Actual grass, pale and thin at first, then greening as the clay soil exhaled what it had been holding, and Nora walked it in the evenings after the light went amber and counted her steps and made calculations in her notebook by lamplight in the room she rented above the dry goods store. The arithmetic of that first summer was tight enough to make her breath short on some nights. 8 goats needed supplemental hay through the leaner stretches, and hay cost money. She was still making one ledger book at a time. But the goats were also reproducing. The does had kidded in March, 5 kids, 3 dwellings and 2 bucklings, and the herd was already growing toward the number she needed to accelerate the clearance on the upper slope. She kept the kids. She kept them all. The town, what little attention it spared for the enterprise, considered this additional evidence of poor judgment. More animals meant more mouths, and more mouths on that ground meant more expense, and the same useless acreage at the end of it. This was the consensus at the feed store, where Nora occasionally heard it through the side window that stood open in summer. She did not argue. Being right, she had found, is its own kind of reply, and it keeps better than a retort. By the second summer, the herd stood at 19 animals, and the lower hillside was clear. The wisteria had retreated to the upper slope and the creek margin, and where the vine had stood for 17 years, the ground came up in a riot of volunteer growth, native grasses, wild clover, the first soft return of blackberry cane, all of it, rooted in soil that Nora knew, when she dug her hand into it, was the richest she had ever touched. The clay had been working, under the vine and under the years, building up a depth and a moisture-holding quality that the neighboring fields' all sandy loam simply could not match. She began in August of that second year to clear the barn. The wisteria had to be cut by hand at the base, and then the goats were brought in to finish the root systems over the course of several weeks. And when the last vine fell away from the barn's west wall, what stood underneath was something that made Nora set down her hatchet and simply look. The hand-hewn oak framework was intact. Every mortise-and joint was tight. The roof had sagged in one corner where a support post had rotted through at the base, but the hand-adzed beams above it had held the structure in place with a stubbornness that seemed almost personal. She replaced the post with timber. She milled herself from a white oak that had fallen in the creek drainage, and by October of that year, the barn was sound. Theodore Bella came to look at it on a cold, clear afternoon that smelled like the season turning, and he walked the length of it with his hands behind his back and said nothing for a long time, which was, Nora had come to understand, his form of high praise. When he finally spoke, he said only that the men who built this barn knew their work, and that good work, properly protected, will wait for you. She thought about her grandfather. She thought he would have agreed with that. It was during the third year that things began to change in ways that were visible from the road, and when things become visible from the road in a small county, the conversation changes with them. The goat herd by the spring of the third year numbered 31 animals, and Nora had begun selling the surplus, wethers, for meat. Breeding age does for milk herds, the occasional exceptional buck at a price that surprised buyers accustomed to the going rate. She priced everything fairly. This was not a strategic decision exactly, or, Not only that, it was partly what she was by nature and partly what Theodore had modeled for her without ever making a lesson of it. Fair pricing, she had noticed, kept people coming back, and people who came back brought others. Word of the quality of her animals moved through the county by the obscure social telegraphy of farm wives at the general store, and by summer of that third year, she had sold animals to 8 families in 3 townships. She banked the money in careful columns in her notebook, and then in an actual account at the county bank, where the clerk looked at the amount of her first deposit with an expression that Nora chose to interpret as respectful. She planted the lower hillside that summer, 20 acres of it, first in a mixture of timothy and red clover, chosen for the clay soil's particular moisture profile, and then 2 acres near the creek in kitchen vegetables for herself and for market. The garden flourished with an excess that embarrassed her slightly, as though the soil were trying to apologize for the years of neglect by producing twice what was asked of it. She brought the surplus to market and sold it, and here is where she gained, without looking for one, her first significant outside witness. A woman named Clara Whitfield came through the market stall with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to quality, lifted one of Nora's ovoid, deep orange carrots from the pile, turned it in her hand and asked where the ground was that had grown this. Nora told her. Clara Whitfield looked at her steadily for a moment and said that she ran the kitchen at the Hollander Hotel in the county seat, and that she would take every carrot, every bean, and every ear of corn that Nora could deliver, and if the quality held, she would also want to discuss the goat cheese. The goat cheese had been a quiet experiment of the previous winter that Nora had not yet mentioned to anyone. She said she thought she could manage that, and Clara Whitfield said good, and that was that. The town noticed this development with the slow, uncomfortable adjustment of people who have made a public prediction and begun to see it fail. The comments at the post office and the feed store changed register, slightly less certainty in them, more hedge. A few people began to say that anyone could see the land had some potential if you worked it right, as though they had always understood this. Nora heard these revised opinions and kept her face pleasant and her own counsel, because she was not done yet, and she knew it. The 4th year opened on a drought. Not the gentle dry spring that was common enough in the hill country, but the real and grinding kind that comes once in a generation and turns the creek beds to cracked ceramic and drives the livestock to the fence for shade that isn't there. It arrived in May, and by July, it had settled over the county like a judgment. The sandy loam fields that surrounded the Pruitt land on 3 sides went hard and pale and began to gap. Pastures cracked. The creek dropped to a thread, and then to a series of disconnected pools. 3 of the neighboring farms lost significant portions of their corn to heat and lack of water before August arrived. And August arrived, as it does in a drought year, like the open door of a furnace. What the drought could not take from Nora Vass was the clay. The bottomland clay that everyone had cited as the land's fundamental flaw. Too wet in spring, too hard in frost, held moisture through the summer heat with a fidelity that the sandy soils around it could not come close to matching. The lower hillside pastures stayed green 2 weeks longer than any of the neighboring fields. The creek margin gardens shrank but never failed. The goats, with access to both the remaining wisteria on the upper slope and the dry year forage that the clay bottomland continued to produce at reduced but real levels, came through the summer, thinner than Nora would have liked, but healthy and with no losses. She supplemented, with hay from a reserve she had laid in the previous fall, the arithmetic of that decision. Made in a wet October when nobody was thinking of drought, she kept to herself with some private satisfaction. The neighbors were not as fortunate. By the 3rd week of August, Silas Meade, whose farm ran along the western boundary of the Pruitt land, and who had been among the more reliable voices of doubt regarding Nora's enterprise, came to her gate on a hot afternoon, with his hat in his hands and the look of a man engaged in a prolonged argument with his own pride. He said he had hay enough for perhaps 3 more weeks and 15 cattle, and he did not know what he was going to do after that. He said it looking somewhere to the left of her face. Starred. Nora looked at him for a moment. This man who had said, not 18 months ago and not quietly, that the county tax office ought to be ashamed for taking a young woman's money for useless ground, and she thought about what she had in the barn. Start. She had enough hay, not lavishly, not to spare in any extravagant way, but enough, if managed carefully, to see her herd through to the fall rains that the weather signs suggested were coming. What she also had, visible in Silas Meade's face and hat, and the set of his shoulders, was a neighbor in real trouble. Hunger changes a man's arithmetic, she had noticed, in the same way it changes a town's. She named him a price for enough hay to carry his cattle to October. It was a fair price, not a drought price. He looked at her then directly, and she thought he might say something, and he did. He said he was grateful to her, and he meant it in a way that reached further back than the hay. It was not Silas Meade alone. Over the course of that August and September, she sold hay to 4 neighboring farms at fair prices, kept careful accounting, and came out of the drought year in better standing financially than she had entered it, not because she had profited from her neighbor's distress, but because she had been the one person in the valley with something to sell. The clay, the despised clay, had been the savings account nobody knew she had. The crisis arrived in its proper form, not the drought itself, which she had weathered, but what came after the drought, wearing the face of helpfulness. His name was Gareth Schofield, and he was a landbroker out of the county seat who had made a quiet practice, over many years, of appearing at the gates of struggling farms in the aftermath of hard seasons and making offers that were, he always said, generous given the circumstances. He arrived at the Pruitt land gate on a morning in late September, in a good coat and a hired buggy, and he told Nora that he represented a consortium of businessmen who had an interest in river bottom acreage for a proposed mill operation and that they were prepared to offer her $240 for the land, clear, which he suggested was more than the property could reasonably be expected to fetch, given its history. He said this with the warm, certain kindness of a man who has decided in advance that he is doing you a favor. Nora stood at the gate and looked at him. She had cleared 31 acres of the land. She had a sound barn on it. She had standing pasture that had just proved its worth through the worst drought in a generation. A creek with water still in it when the neighboring creeks had gone dry. A herd of 43 goats of documented quality. A market relationship with the Hollander Hotel kitchen, and an offer from Silas Meade and 2 other neighbors to lease grazing rights on the cleared acreage she wasn't yet using at rates that would, combined, exceed $240 within 2 years. She knew all of this with the precision of a woman who had been doing the arithmetic in her notebook by lamplight for 4 years. She also knew, because she had checked the county records in June, that the mill consortium had already surveyed the creek access on her eastern boundary and filed a preliminary easement inquiry that Schofield had chosen not to mention. She said, quietly, "How did you come to know the survey count on the creek access if your interest is only in a mill location?" It was not precisely a question. Schofield's composure shifted by a fraction of a degree that was in a man of that training equivalent to a wince. He began to say something about routine assessments and public records, and she let him say it. And when he finished, she told him that the land was not for sale and that the creek access rights, as he perhaps knew, were attached to the deed and were not separable without her consent, which she did not intend to give. She thanked him for coming. She opened the gate, not for him, but because it was time for the afternoon shift of the herd to move to the upper slope, and the goats came through in their rolling, confident pour and parted around Schofield's good boots without particular regard for his errand or his coat, and he stood in the middle of them with the expression of a man recalculating. And then he left word of that conversation, as word tends to do in small counties, traveled faster than the buggy that carried Schofield back to the county seat. Nora did not tell it. She did not need to, because Silas Meade had been mending fence along the western boundary that morning and had heard the shape of it, if not all the words, and Silas Meade had a wife who had a good memory and a precise way of conveying information at the general store. By the end of that week, the county had the story in its broad outlines, and the outlines were accurate enough for the moral to come through clearly. The young woman who had bought the ruined land for $28 had turned away $240, and the man who had come to acquire it cheap had gone back empty-handed. It is easier to admire a thing you once mocked if the mocking is far enough behind you, and the thing in question has stopped needing your opinion of it. The town of Harlan County, as a general matter, managed this transition with more grace than might have been expected, partly because the drought had shaken loose some certainties, and partly because Nora Vass had never, in 4 years of being doubted and commented upon and pitied, given anyone a reason to feel attacked. She had simply worked. She had kept her accounting straight and her prices fair, and her gate open when it needed to be open. When the woman from the Hollander Hotel came to the farm that October to look at the cheese cave Nora had dug into the north bank of the barn hill, a low, cool, clay-lined room where the soft rounds of goat cheese aged on shelves of split cedar, Clara Whitfield tasted 3 samples, looked around the cave with a lamp held close, and said she wanted a standing contract for 12 wheels a month at a price she named that made Nora's notebook figures reform themselves considerably in the direction of comfort. 2 weeks later, a man named Harper, who dealt in breeding stock across 4 counties and had heard of the herd through the circuitous route of 3 separate farm sales, came to look at the buckline and paid, without apparent distress, a price per animal that Nora had privately thought was the highest she could hope to ask. He said the temperament and the conformation were the best he had seen in the hill country, which was high praise from a man whose voice contained no superlatives in reserve. The barn that appeared in the last week of September, stripped of its vine and standing in the pale fall light, became a thing the county found it could be proud of in retrospect, as places and people often become admirable once the danger of admiring them early has passed. It was a genuinely beautiful structure, as anyone who looked at it could plainly see, the adze marks on the beams still crisp after 30 years, the proportions of a builder who understood load and light, the oak sills anchored to fieldstone footings, laid with the patient exactitude of someone who expected the building to outlast them. Nora had the roof reshingled and the doors rehung on new iron strap hinges. She had the blacksmith make to the original pattern, and on the day she moved the herd into the barn for the first winter in their own covered quarters, a small boy named Eli, who was the youngest son of a family that farmed the land to the north and who had attached himself to the farm over the course of the summer with the single-minded devotion of a child who has found a thing that makes sense to him, announced that he had names for all 43 goats and recited them from memory without pausing, which took slightly longer than it sounds. Nora listened to the full recitation, with her arms folded and her face composed, and when Eli finished, she said, "That was fine work," and she was glad to know it. And Eli went in to check on a doeling he had named Margaret after the county librarian. Theodore Bella came that evening as the light went flat and orange over the ridge, coming through the gate with a bottle of something that he said his wife had made and that he said was appropriate for a day like this. And they sat on the barn step, and Theodore looked out at the pasture and the creek and the hillside that had, in the 4 years since Nora had first laid her hands on the foundation timbers through a curtain of vine, become the most deliberately tended piece of ground in the valley. He said, after a long, comfortable silence, that he thought of what she had done here sometimes when people told him that a thing could not be done. She asked him what he thought when he thought of it. He said he thought about what his father had told him when he was a young man on a different piece of difficult land in a different country, which was the same thing he had told her 4 years ago and which he believed then and now, that the people who call a thing worthless are almost always telling you where the opportunity is hiding. He said he had learned over many years that the word worthless is usually spoken by someone who lacks the patience or the eye to see the value that has not yet been uncovered. He swirled the glass once, looked at the barn, and added that it was nice, also, when the barn turned out to be as good as the land. Nora looked at the barn. It had been there for 30 years before she was born, waiting under the vine, and it would be there for 30 more. And the land around it was waking up from a long, involuntary sleep with the enthusiasm of a thing that had been waiting patiently for someone to ask something of it. The creek ran over the fieldstone spillway she had built in August, at a good clear level, fed by clay-held moisture that the drought had not reached. The herd was inside, quiet and settled in the straw, and from where she sat, She could hear the low, soft conversation of animals that are properly housed and properly fed and have nothing particular to worry about tonight. The evening smelled of turned earth and cedar, and the particular green bitterness of wisteria burning somewhere up the ridge where a neighbor was clearing. Finally, a fence row that the vine had held for years. She had $31 when she started, and she had 28 of them in the county tax office before the end of the week. What she had at the end of 4 years was harder to put in a single column: 43 goats and their confirmed offspring, a sound barn on fieldstone footings, 31 cleared acres in standing grass, a market contract with the Hollander Hotel, a cheese cave in the clay bank, and a notebook filled on both sides with the arithmetic of a thing everyone told her was impossible. She also had, though she would not have said so herself, the county's attention in a way that carried its own quiet authority. Not the noisy attention of someone who has beaten people in an argument, but the steadier kind that comes from having been proven right by the most patient of all judges, which is time and the land that works through it. The people of Harlan County would later say, and they were right to say it, that nobody had done more with worse ground in living memory, and they would say it without the footnote they deserved to attach, which was that they had told her clearly and collectively that it could not be done. Nora Vass did not attach it for them. She did not have to. In a county where everyone keeps a long memory and an honest accounting, some debts settle themselves, the way the land settles after a long rain, slowly and thoroughly and without any particular announcement, into a new and more useful arrangement. She closed the barn doors against the evening chill and went inside, and the clay held what it always held, and the goats slept.